Thanks everyone for coming. I'm Craig Burnett. I'm the Director of Exhibitions here at Blain Southern. I'm going to ask our distinguished panel of painters a few questions, but first I'm going to say a few things about the show and about play. I should maybe just introduce everybody. This is Joan Snyder. This is Daniel Sturges, who played a very important role in putting the show together. Amy Feldman and Dan Walsh. I was going to say that we're here because of Jeremy Moon, whose painting is there, because this show, in a way, has its origins in a conversation between me and Dan Sturges and Rob Moon, who's here in the audience, who is Jeremy's son and an artist himself. And it started as a conversation about Jeremy, and then it led into Daniel's work, and then it broadened out into ideas about the grid and playfulness. But I'm just going to change that a little bit, just because I'm going to say instead that, you see I have a speech, but I'm not reading it, so I may have to look down on the paper. That we're all here tonight, everyone is here, if you don't know it, because of John Ashbery. And I'm saying that because John Ashbery died on Sunday. And it's really through John Ashbery's poetry that I discovered this idea of play. I say discovered, but it's more I made it up. And maybe I'm just going to turn to my sheet now so I can say what I want to say exactly. I don't know if you all know who John Ashbery is, but until he died, he was, I would say, America's greatest poet. I started reading his poetry when I was in my early 20s, and I then ended up writing about John, and then when I was reading his poetry, I kept seeing this word play, and then his work itself is very playful. So I assumed that John Ashbery was very intentionally using this word play and very intentionally making playful poetry. And I assumed that he knew a lot about play, because then a professor of mine said, oh, there's a whole history of play in Western aesthetics, and it's a really important idea. And it sent me on a long research tour from Schiller to Huizinga and Gadamer. These are maybe names that nobody knows, but they're important writers about play. And then, so in 2004, well, actually I met Joan Ashbery in 1996, but in 2004 I went to interview him formally for Frieze magazine. And when I was there, I thought, I have to test my theory. Surely this is a good chance. I said, well, John, in your poetry you use the word play a lot. And he said, I do? And he has a very distinctive voice. And I said, yes. And then I gave him some examples of where he used the word play, and he said, oh, now that you mention it, I do, you're right. And I said, is writing poetry play? And he said, well, I guess it is. And then he compared his process to playing hide and seek with himself, or hide and seek with an invisible other, which I think is a really beautiful idea. But then I asked him, well, surely you know that play is a really important idea in the history of aesthetics. And he said, no, I had no idea, and he had never read anything about play, and so I thought, well, I'd made it all up, but his poetry played me and threw me in a certain direction, and I thought that was a kind of important lesson about what art can do to its audience, and how it can create ideas in a viewer or in a reader that maybe aren't there, but they're there because the viewer sees them, and I think that's okay. And I think also, if it weren't for John Ashbery, maybe I wouldn't have seen the ideas that I saw in Jeff Wall's photograph, which is right there, which is called Playground Structure, and because it's called, the word play is there, it triggered all these ideas of play. And when I said to Jeff, this photograph is about abstract art, he said, maybe, I don't know, but that's also Jeff's attitude these days. So I think it is about abstract art, and I think probably if you pushed him, he would agree. So, now, there's a lot more to say about play, but I'm not going to say it. But if anyone would like an annotated reading list, I have one, and I can give you one after you come see me. So, I just want to say, before I ask questions of the painters, which is why everybody's here, just a couple further thoughts about Jeff's photograph. What I want to draw out of that in terms of play is if you look at the photograph, there's the climbing frame, and the climbing frame is a grid-like structure, and it's unchanging, it's objective, by which I mean it's the same to everybody. And it's the same for every kid who decides to climb inside or climb to the top or just maybe not climb inside at all, watch it from the grass. And yet, when each kid uses the climbing frame, they have a different experience. So there's a sense of improvisation within a structure. And in that way, the climbing frame is like a sculpture, or it's like a musical score, or it's like a painting. So a musical score is an objective structure that every time a musician interprets it, it's slightly different. And I would like to make the same comparison for the paintings in this show, that they can be like musical scores, and that when they are interpreted by different people, they're played. So this is the idea of play that I want to emphasize, among many, that it's not about humor or goofiness, this idea of play or child's play, but it's more about self-forgetting, about losing yourself in the structure of an artwork, and about a certain kind of ecstasy, which is just escaping yourself. So that's what I wanted to emphasize about play, but now we get to talk to the painters. So I'm going to sit down. I'm going to ask Joan the first question, and Joan's untitled painting here from 1969 is the oldest painting in the show. She painted it in 1969. At that year, Joan, you started using the grid, I think, if I'm right. I wonder if you could talk about the grid in that painting, or the grid in your paintings in general, which is, if you look at the painting at the very top, there's just, you can see the faint pencil lines of a grid, which Joan had sketched in to start the painting. So, Joan, I wonder if you could talk about that painting in particular, and about your use of the grid, and whether that structure in the painting offered you a chance to improvise, or what it meant to you at the time.
So first of all, I have to say that it was 50 years ago, almost. So for me to remember, but I do remember. Actually, your question made me think about it again, and maybe even in a new way. Right before I made that painting, I was making a whole series of paintings that in it was like the mid to late 60s, that were really related to what I felt was a female sensibility. I was using, it was anthropomorphic, and it was not figurative, but it was about women's bodies. And it was using flocking and lentils and thread and paste and gel, and somehow all these materials, I kind of turned them into what I felt, like membranes and things that related to what I experienced as a woman. I then wanted to move from there to something a little bit more abstract. And one of the ideas that occurred to me was the idea of painting a paint stroke. Making a paint stroke and then painting it, making a paint stroke and then spraying it. Putting a paint stroke in this kind of field with perhaps a grid. And I know that the grid, in some ways, happened because I was working with children in Bed-Stuy, which is a very poor neighborhood, and I love children's art, and a lot of their art was made on lined yellow paper, and I mean, I know that influenced me. I know the tongue and groove wall in my studio influenced me because I saw little drips on it, and it was a grid. I know music influenced me, that I wanted somehow to put in more, not less, and I wanted it to be more than color field painting, and I wanted it to be more than, you know, what I was looking at the time. I mean, I really wanted to be able to tell a whole story in a painting, like a score, like a symphony. So that's really where this was coming from, but that painting is sort of very veiled and delicate, and I mean, every mark I made was specific and, you know, very carefully made, and then, of course, I took the spray can and just sprayed. Which was not so delicate a move. But down the street from me was Pearl Paint. I don't know, Canal Street in New York. And I bought a lot of my materials at Pearl Paint, which at the time was a paint store, not an art supply store. So I was buying paint supplies. But anyway, that's, you know, it really came out of the female sensibility thing, and I can see it when I look at it. I mean, it's very delicate. I mean, it's very layered, it's very veiled. I love the layers. I mean, I wanted to be able to see that pencil line. And I wanted to be able to, it was the beginning of my thinking about the anatomy of a painting also. And the anatomy of a stroke. I mean, where you could see different parts of the stroke at once.
And then, I mentioned Rosalind Krauss's essay in the press release, and it was influential. And she talks about the grid as a masculine form, as a extremely masculine form. So I wonder whether this sense of femininity being veiled or painted over top of it, you probably weren't aware of it in the same way that.
Well, Rosalind Krauss never mentioned my name, ever.
Yeah.
In her whole career. So
So to hell with her.
So I don't care about Rosalind Krauss. It's a masculine form? I mean, really?
Yeah, I don't know, yeah. You tell me, I
don't know, you know. I never thought about that.
Yeah, good, okay. I should have mentioned, I don't think I did, that when we're finished, everyone here will have a chance to ask Joan and everyone else questions. Okay, great.
Sorry, Rosalind Krauss.
She doesn't like Jeff's work either, so you know. Okay, let me ask Daniel a question. I'll say Daniel just to differentiate, Dan and Daniel. Speaking of grids, so Daniel's work is here and there. One of the shibboleths of high abstraction from 20th century is flatness of the picture plane, the rejection of depth. And one of the things you do in your paintings is play with that, I think, very successfully, in terms of using warm and cold tones so that there's a real sense of shifting within the painting itself. So, do you want to talk about how you achieve that and what that means to you? I mean, the painting itself, what's interesting about your work is that if you photograph it, it's actually impossible to photograph, which is really interesting. But when you see it, it's ceaseless in its motion, and it actually is quite annoying to look at sometimes. They're extraordinary, but they are almost impossible to look at, which is really amazing thing to achieve in paint, I think.
Okay, well, I'll say some things about that. So I think that one thing a painting is a flat surface, and certainly within a history of modernism or a history of modernist painting, there's been a number of artists that have thought about that surface, and I think by changing the tones of whites or changing the tones of reds very slightly, or in some ways quite dramatically, I think that actually they might look quite slight, you can kind of confuse that. And I'm also quite intrigued by the idea of what I sort of say is doing things slightly wrong, or doing things which seem, you think you get it, or you think you see something straight away, but then actually realize you don't. So you think, oh, it's just a black and white check painting, but then you realize, actually, no, there are loads of different whites here and different blacks. And it slows you down. A reading which you might have thought was quite quick becomes something which is slower. And then I think also there's an element where you're thinking about the way that they get made, about the time and the labor and the and some sort of a very graphic-looking image, an image which seems to have this graphic quality. You then realise has been made very, very slowly by hand, and that gives another sense of sort of confusion, or what I sometimes refer to as a kind of awkwardness within the painting, and the kind of awkwardness because it's sort of I don't know, questions or challenges a kind of expectation, and asks you, or I hope asks people looking at it, some of those questions about challenging that sort of expectation of what the painting is. And in a funny way, it was intriguing that you mentioned Ashbury right at the beginning, because I'm sure you read, as I did, the New York Times review of sort of obituary, which was just up online, and it said at the end of it, there's a nice little quote, and I'm going to get it wrong, but he was asked about what was the poet's relationship to his audience, and he was talking about, in this quote, and to paraphrase, he was talking about not wanting to shock an audience because he thought that was about, there was something aggressive within that act. And he likened it to wearing sort of loud confrontational clothes. Right. Whereas he would be wearing clothes which were just off, just not quite, just not matching, with the idea that that would make someone in the reading the poem sort of question their own attire or question their own assumptions about how they were, and I like that very much. Okay. That idea of throwing something back.
So the awkwardness of language that Ashbury might, because his sentences wouldn't compute in a normal grammatical way often, and in the same way that your paintings don't quite compute visually.
And I think there's also, and I think there's a sort of sensibility which I see I certainly see in many of the paintings within this exhibition, but certainly within Jeremy Moon's work, there's an awkwardness which I very much appreciate, to do with, you sort of assume you might be getting something, but then something else emerges, and it's that, what emerges then is so wonderful, because it's a kind of new experience.
Okay. Just before I go on, I just wondered if you could talk about a kind of sense of knowingness in your work, just back to my original question of the grid and the expectations of abstraction and your toying with it. I wonder to what extent, you talk about a sensibility and awkwardness, but I wonder if at the same time you're pushing theoretical, more theoretical ideas about, or conceptions about what abstraction is.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that abstraction is the language of painting of the 20th century. Obviously, there's earlier precedents of it, but those precedents are in a sense framed by modernism, and it's also a fairly, you could say, a fairly new language in the history of painting. It's a fairly new language, but it is tied to a set of beliefs which you could call modernist beliefs, which might want to be challenged or might seem to be outmoded. And that's not saying that I don't love some of those paintings, and I do. And one of the things that I'm quite intrigued by is how a painting might be able to speak with more than one voice. That one can be sort of both for and against something at the same time. One can sort of have a sort of multiple tongue within a painting. And I think that is a sort of theoretical position around certainty, around provisionality, around, there's a lot within the history of painting, there's a lot of big, the history of painting is a gendered history. It's a history where a lot of big claims have been made for paintings, and clearly there are many histories of painting, and clearly there are many there are many voices that can be held within that, and I think those are some of the things that I think about when making the work. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask Amy a question. Something I think really interesting happened when we put Amy's painting Naked Baked beside Ice Palace, which when I was planning the show and talking to Dan, they weren't together, but then when we got them in the room, I think a great relationship was formed, a forced marriage. And I think the reason why that happened is it brought out something really interesting in Amy's work. And what I'll ask Amy is that although your forms are sensual, they suggest bodies, they're also monochrome, they suggest body parts, body movement. What I keep going back to is this feeling of, I look at Jeremy Moon's painting and your painting, and it's almost like Jeremy Moon's Ice Palace is a structure for a dance, and then your painting is the dance happening over the structure. So I wondered, given that your process is very physical, you stand in front of the painting, you have to do it as a one-off. I wonder about that implied structure that is always present in your paintings. There's a sense of a grid. You could almost put that structure behind your painting and then you improvised within it. So about that structure that you start with in a painting, I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, I'm very conscious of I guess when I look at a blank canvas, I do see a grid underneath before I begin to make the painting, and that lets me be conscious of the axes of the painting, because I want there to be a kind of like asymmetrical symmetry happening within the frame.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what's important about the asymmetry?
Well, it kind of goes back to what you were saying. There's this contradiction on the surface of rigidity of the form and then fluidity and openness. So there's a sense of clarity and contradiction at the same time. You know, a painting having different tongues.
Okay. And you think, do you think that's visible or felt by the viewer when they see your work? I mean, you may not be able to answer that,
hope
but
so.
yeah.
You know, I mean, the reason for kind of tweaking the painting one way or the other on the grid would be to kind of create a sense of destabilization. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to just talk about how the painting is made in those terms? So you say you think about the grid when you're facing the canvas, but a lot of people here don't. I know what you do, right. But how you stand, you get up there and it's an act. It's a kind of balancing act when you start to paint. I mean, but maybe you could describe it in a better way.
Is the canvas on the floor?
No. I like there to be drips, and it's important for me that the gravity of the drip is felt. It kind of grounds the painting.
You're on a ladder, is it?
Most of the time, milk crates. But if it's a larger painting, then a couple of ladders, actually, so I can move back and forth between the two. I really should get a scaffold in the studio. It'd probably be safer. It's harder to step back, I think, off of the scaffold, which is part of my process. You know, I'll make a mark, and then I think a lot of painters do that, and then you step away from it. Sure.
You'll make a mark and step back.
Yes.
Has the volume been turned up? Okay. Okay, let me ask Dan a question. Dan was here earlier and we were talking, and Dan described the grid as a user-friendly system, I think is how you described it, or a very open. that allows you to start painting. But then you talked about how the artist could use the grid, but also you talked about how there's a process that the artist has to go through to earn his or her ability to play, which I thought was a really interesting idea. So I wonder if you could talk about that. I use the word mastery, which you shied away from, which I can understand why, but I wonder if you could talk about that stage where you feel you can play.
What I like about the grid is that it's so neutral. I like neutrality as a position, and I think I think we all feel that way, in that since whenever we've been anti-idealist. We don't want to tell a strong story. The grid is I joke that the grid is this neutral place that you can exist in painting. But I always laugh at myself saying, hell if I'm not going to go down kicking and screaming that that's not the case. When I think about play, I think about setting things in motion. Settings, you can see my paintings are a bit more fussed over than, well, maybe Daniel and I have that in common, but
My paintings are fussed
it's like finding a place or developing painting enough that play can happen. But we're all interested. You know, we could debate tonight about what is an interesting painting, but if we do not if we don't say that the grid's a codified objective, you know, and that it's dead, and then we're going to beat the dead horse, I want to see some interesting dynamics in painting. So you have to have an understanding of the your basic stock visual intelligence, or you have to have digested some history, like the Mondrians and the Solowit is a big model for me. How to make, as opposed to rigor as opposed to being very rigorous for one thing, like we were talking about Marioni, someone I don't particularly like, but Joseph Marioni. How to make a complex painting that is playful, you know, and not be idealistic at the same time. You know, not after the classic Greenbergian complexity, or you know, of course, any self-respecting artist is going to be concerned with the flatness, with the space of the paintings, as Daniel was saying. But play is easy, but complex play, that's another story, and I guess that's what I'm talking about.
Okay. As I was sort of reading a bit in the lead up to this, I thought, well, you know, there's a history of this kind of tragic sense of abstraction. And then I found that Rothko had a list of all the ingredients of a painting, and to me, Rothko is a kind of antithesis of play. It's tragedy, it's sublime. But he had a list of 8 or 9 things, and one of them was play, the human element, he called it. I suppose that level of complexity is what he had a list of, and it was sort of everything that you wanted in an artwork. It was maybe too much. So do you think that this, before you can play, it's just a matter of educating yourself, or just having a degree of
doing time in front of the painting, and answering to the masters. You could play for the sake of freeing yourself from yourself, like I love that Asbury, the plain shadow. What was that expression?
Playing hide and seek
with
with yourself, yeah, and an invisible other, yeah.
You could serve it up as an individual struggle, you know, with oneself and freeing oneself. You know, you need play to free yourself from your demons, from that you like, too many bright colors and it's confusing all your friends, all your critics come in and say, and they're saying something and you believe something else. Play could be a learning tool, just to free up, to free yourself up. But in today's climate, what else is there? You want to keep yourself interested. So you will create playful situations to interest you and to learn.
Why don't I ask you a really simple question? What is how do you start a painting? You don't start with a kind of diagram or a drawing, do you? You start...
No, I put some marks down, like where, like this one here would be 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I would need to know where those horizontal lines are.
Okay.
But I just put little points.
And then you improvise within that?
I don't use tape as an edge. I'll paint up to an edge or something like that.
Okay.
But it's just, I never liked the look of, at least in my paintings, I never liked the look of the taped edge.
Right.
So I developed over time out of default just a technique where certain kind of brushes, I was able to build a clean edge without tape. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you pencil anything out?
Excuse me?
Do you pencil anything before you...
No.
Right, and
But I'm using a tape measure, definitely in the beginning.
a tape measure to get that, okay. But in fact, your work in reproduction looks incredibly graphic, but when you see the paintings, you can see translucency, you can see brushstrokes. So, I mean, these are, you're playing with that flatness, that graphicness, but also there's a painterly quality on a level that you just don't see in reproduction.
Yeah, I could say it's, I'm entertaining myself. I joked one time to a friend that I'm making the most difficult paintings, most complicated way to make a painting just to stay interested.
Okay.
Again, I propose for myself a very passive, neutral position and entertaining myself in a complex way.
Okay. Okay, let's ask Joan another question. Speaking of entertaining yourself, you started using the grid in 1969, and then it's really manifest in New Squares, which is a painting from 2 years ago, so your memory should be very vivid of when you made that. I think there's a few things to say about that painting, but I just want to ask you one question which interested me when I saw the painting, is that at the center of it, or the sort of the left center, there's almost a primary yellow. And then all the other colors are, Dan might call them awkward, but they're difficult to describe, they're difficult to name. So there's a bit of glitter on the green, there's a kind of plum or two, there's some sort of dark, almost black. So I wonder, first question is, 50 years later, you're using the grid in New Squares. And how did you entertain yourself, in Dan's terms, with that painting?
Well, it's true that when I make a painting like that, I am kind of getting away from what I've been doing and going back to something that's, for me, it's meditative. I mean, it's kind of trance-like. I'm not, I actually have pictures of almost every stage of lots of paintings. I just snap pictures as I go because I'm so interested in one thing leading to another. But I can't really say how that palette happens. I mean, it happens because there's this and there's this, and then, it just keeps building and developing. I noticed the glitter on there today. That glitter was not intentional.
All right.
There's glitter all over my studio.
Okay.
So glitter.
You went away and a fairy came at night.
Glitter happens, it got into the painting. I mean,
Glitter
it was
happens.
really nice. I mean, I'm not going to go brush it off. But when I go back to a square painting, it really is because I want the thing with the square paintings that really fascinate and interest me are how the edges meet. you know, how's that yellow going to sit against the black or the blue or the light green, or, you know, the edges are really what's important, and how they talk to each other and how they meet and how they, it becomes very complicated and complex.
And is it just a certain pleasure that you derive from those relationships?
It's a lot of pleasure, yeah, that I derive from those relationships. I don't think of myself, I mean, I really love being in my studio. And sometimes as intense and as difficult as the subject matter might be, I'm always happy when I'm in there. I'm not necessarily making cheerful paintings all the time. But the way I see it is that, well, I start a painting, I get a painting idea usually by sitting in a concert. I go to a lot of concerts and listen to a lot of music, and I make sketches. My sketches are often about 2 years behind my paintings. So if I look at my sketchbook now, I might be ready for something I did 2 years ago or a year ago. Because listening to music really educates me.
So you bring a sketchbook into a concert hall?
I bring a sketchbook into a concert hall, and I work there. I mean, it really is working for me, and I love it. So then I build up a painting, and what I think of as play is that at a certain point in a painting, and I tell this to students all the time, you have to be able to put yourself on automatic pilot. Now maybe when you're making very minimal, you know, careful, maybe you never put yourself on automatic pilot, I don't know. But I mean, I go on automatic pilot, and I know when I'm on automatic pilot, I trust my process, and I'm just like, I go. And then I know that, you know, that things are really moving along in a way that I want them to move along. Or I trust that they will be moving along that way.
So you mean you lose yourself in the structure of the artwork?
You lose yourself. You know, you stop thinking. You have to stop thinking. You have to stop planning. You have to stop, you know. After so many years of being a painter, you know, I trust my process.
Right.
That's earned.
What was that, Dan? Sorry.
That's earned play.
Yeah, there you go. It is. Yeah. That's a.
Right.
Well, I mean, one idea of play is that it is a form of self-forgetting, and you lose yourself into the structure of the game. Yeah.
Right. I mean, you always have to step back and say, "Wait a minute," you know. But there is a sense of losing myself and you know, not being aware of almost, you know, when I had really, really bad knees, I would be in the studio painting and just so happy and fine and everything was fine. The minute I stopped painting, I would be, oh my God, I can't even walk. I mean, my knees were so bad, you know, so I really do lose myself in a certain way.
Right,
Yeah.
right, okay. Painting as painkiller. There you go.
Exactly.
We should all try it. Okay, I want to then contradict myself in a way and just ask Dan a question. Another idea of play is abstraction in a comic mode, and by comic I don't mean hardy har and jokes, but the opposite of tragic, so that a comedy ends in a marriage, it keeps going, right? It doesn't end in a death. And I think your paintings are in that mode in the sense of that ceaseless movement, but also there is an element of silliness in them, in a well-earned silliness, in terms of the motion. There's the balls moving through the space. So I just wondered if you want to talk about that sense of.
Sure. So I think that I think that I'm interested in what sometimes I think of as sort of the human quality within the paintings, and the way that you can anthropomorphize them, and you can think of you can certainly think of structures or the geometric shapes, which is what they're made from in a way, as you begin to sort of have relationships with them, and you kind of wonder whether that's a sensible thing to be doing. And I think that's sort of a play, which I think it is, between something being very rigid and something being quite casual, and something which seems to be one thing but is actually trying to be something else, is is interesting. And I think it is about, it's about an attitude to the world, perhaps. It's about quite big questions, if you like, but it's also about the way that one formally arranges the ingredients of a painting. I think that whether it's humour or whether it's a sort of a human sort of quality, or whether it's a sort of a sort of kind of lifefulness within them. All of that seems an interesting thing to be capturing within a painting.
Okay, great. Bergson's definition of the comic is somebody who's rigid, who's unmoving. So your paintings are rigid and yet moving.
Yeah.
There's a kind of paradoxical quality.
Well,
to it.
yeah, I mean, I think that idea, as I said, the idea of things being more than one thing at one moment interests me. So the idea that something can seem very rigid but actually have a softness to it, or that something seems very mechanically made but actually you realise it's been made very slowly with sable brushes, sort of building up layers and layers of paint, or something that seems very architecturally structured suddenly actually sort of collapses. So all of those are all of those sort of certainties I like to sort of to use, really, to kind of use, question, think about, and absolutely, as Joan was saying, when one's making the painting, I'm completely lost in doing it, and there are moments when one stops and looks and thinks, goodness, how many
knees
hours
hurt.
how many hours have gone by, or this one needs to redo a little bit or rework it. But they emerge slowly in a way, as many coats of paint slowly build up.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Okay, I'm going to ask Amy a question based on some conversations we've had, which in a way I wouldn't mind just addressing to everyone here, which Amy was a little bit reluctant to talk about her work too much in terms of humor, and yet you talked about being aware of your audience in a way that a comedian is aware of his or her audience in terms of structuring the joke and delivering the punchline. So I wonder, maybe you could correct your memory of our conversation, but talk about that in terms of structuring the joke and delivering the punchline and how that relates to your work.
Structuring the joke. I guess that has to do with the delivery of the mark. Either you make a mark and it works, and you hit the punchline, or you don't.
Right. And how do you know if your audience laughs? Or how do you do? I mean, Guston said people should laugh in front of my paintings, but of course there's a slightly darkness to that. But how do you? Maybe I could ask, what is your ideal viewer? How would they respond to that, or how do you know?
I think I shy away from talking about humor in the work because it often turns into like whimsy. I feel like comedy is a kind of dark thing. People sort of like laugh at what they don't like about themselves or their inadequacies. So it's like that kind of display of humor. And then I do think that when I'm painting, there is a certain delivery and like an elegance of the line that needs to be just right, to make the audience laugh. And I guess I just know when I'm gonna make the audience laugh, or I, have to start over and make another painting. I want there to definitely be a lightness in my paintings, but I also I want them to have another kind of resonance, maybe make the viewer a little bit more self-aware, I suppose, which is
kind of what a comedian can do as well.
Right. I guess in some more recent work, I've been pushing that idea a little bit, where there are often areas where the viewer is sort of asked to complete the painting with his or her eye. So there's an implied line that suggests complete form, and the form still feels very whole and iconic. So that's like a
What,
tricky
do you do other colors besides the gray?
Right now, I am only working with gray.
Right now, meaning the last year or 2 years?
Well, since 2009. I've
Only
been
gray?
Only gray. Yeah.
Why?
There's a lot of color in gray.
Why?
It's a way for me to. It was a way for me to distill, and then I like the idea of, I guess, the potential of painting to kind of. This is a little broad, but like distill human experience in a way, and so I like that kind of removal.
I mean, one way I think maybe to think about the grayness and also the humor and also about what you were saying about the viewer finishing the work is that I think it's quite liberating for the viewer to have that space to enter your paintings, and I think that's emphasized by the monochrome quality, and I think that's true in black and white photography as well, that a black and white photograph gives the viewer more space to color in the details.
Yes. I think because the grays are all mixed, they're full of color, and there's like a different kind of psychology to them, I guess, you could say. But
Okay.
yeah, they're.
It emphasizes the gesture a little more too, which is so important.
Right, and if
That
you
is singular.
and if it were blue or red, there would be associations. I mean, it was interesting that with Joan's new squares, it's very difficult to make associations with those colors because they're just sort of they're natural but not quite, and so they're not. Primary colors have a certain association with modernism, but all of these tertiary or mucky colors, they take you in different directions. Okay, I'm going to ask Dan one more question, which I'd like to address to everybody in a way, and then we can hand it over to everybody here. When Dan was here earlier, he talked about playfulness in terms of freedom and also in terms of self-determination and not being restrained by certain expectations of what an artist is or what an artist can make in terms of, well, maybe in terms of a signature style. I think Joan's career emphasizes that. There's a range of different modes that Joan's painted in. So I wonder if you could talk about playfulness in terms of that sort of liberating freedom and I mean, it's a subject you brought up, so maybe you could elaborate on that a bit.
We talked about three things, so I guess I have this, again, we're dealing with so many gray scales here, but I have this idea about of saturation or entropy in art, that everything's being with the internet and all our visual education now, we're able to, you could claim this about music too, we're able to pigeonhole and identify things so quickly. We're not looking at anything anymore. Of course, probably the people in here are looking, but there's this general fear for me in being defined, or I like the word codified, that we're maybe a way of using play is to get away from definitions. It'd be the opposite of what I talked about before, rigor. Is this what we're...
Yeah, this is good. I like it. I don't know everyone else. Yeah. I
feel, okay, we all agree that we're trying to make interesting paintings and hopefully surprise ourselves once in a while in the studio, and we're interested in a dialogue with the public. But to be defined is a very scary thing. For someone to say, yeah, I know your work, it's this, this, and this, and it's like, wrap it up into with a bow and send it off. A way to apply play would be to avoid definition, or to open up an avenue of painting or thought that would trip up. I think Daniel was talking about this. Trip up readings of the work, or just feel like we all talked about it. Feel like you're in front of a painting. You're not really. You don't know what's the definition is. I certainly know when I'm painting one of these brushstrokes. I know exactly what it is. But when it's done, you can't define the work. That would certainly be a goal, however anti-idealistic we all are here. That would certainly be a goal of an artist. But this idea of being defined, it concerns me, because there's so many people, there's so many venues of writing and blogs and stuff like this. There's a lot of words being thrown at art these days. A lot of verbiage and stuff, and it's a
what kind of words do you mean?
self-survival.
Do you mean what kind of words? I mean, just
Categori-
negative
just
categories.
categorization,
Okay.
pigeonholing. It's a form of self-survival, in other words, to avoid definition.
Okay.
And so maybe play is one of the keys to freeing oneself from exactly, what you were after last year is exactly what you're trying to escape from this year, and so on.
Great. Okay. Yeah. This just reminds me. I just want to say one more thing before we hand it over to people. That there's an article in the Guardian recently by a woman who. I think she was born in Pakistan and raised in Texas, and her family was quite strict. And then she talked about all the millenarian or eschatological urges in America and all over the world, nationalistic. And I thought, as I was reading this, I thought, well, actually, this is a perfect example of anti-play, of doom-mongering, knowing that you're right. Saying, Guston said an artist should always never claim to be right, I think it was. And so I think what you're talking about now,
Claim to be what? Excuse me?
to be right, to be correct, yeah. So I think this, we could bring it up politically in the current political climate of saying you're right, or claiming to know the future, or claiming to own the future. I think that this feeling of play, humor, all of these ideas are really important for undercutting that, or liberating, or offering a space of freedom.